They said the patients died peacefully, smiling, but when they pried up the chapel floorboards, they found the truth buried in glass, 847 jars, labeled in Latin, sealed in wax, and filled with pieces of the dead. You weren't supposed to hear that. That sentence alone was sealed in a state file labeled, "Do not circulate, ecclesiastical oversight." But here we are, and now that you've heard it, you'll never see medicine the same way again. Let me tell you a story the church never told, a story Harvard buried, a story Salem forgot, or tried to. It begins not with witches, but with healers, not with fire, but with faith. In 1832, 3 brothers arrived in Massachusetts under the banner of divine compassion. Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne, the eldest, cold eyes, precise voice, educated in the best European medical houses. Reverend Obadiah Hawthorne, a preacher whose voice could bring hardened men to their knees, speaking of divine miracles as if he'd performed them himself. And Ezekiel, the quiet one, the chemist, the artisan of the compounds that moved the soul, as he once wrote. But that's not what they moved. They purchased a forgotten estate on the outskirts of Salem, a place avoided by locals for reasons that go unspoken in town histories. They built their sanctuary there, called it the Divine Healing Sanctuary, and for 37 years it operated with perfect, sacred deception. They cured the blind, the paralyzed, the dying. The results were undeniable. Dozens walking again, seeing again, weeping in joy. And behind it all, meticulous records, journals bound in human skin leather, page after page of patient transformation. But it was all a design, a beautiful, flawless lie, because none of those patients had been sick until the brothers made them sick. And those who truly were sick, they never left. This isn't just fraud. This was America's first medical massacre, and what they discovered in that basement laboratory would forever rewrite the boundary between faith, medicine, and death. This channel is not for the weak. It's for the marked. The men who know something is wrong, not just with history, but with the systems we've trusted. You've taken the first step. Now, keep walking. Because what the Hawthorne Brothers unlocked didn't end in 1832. You have to understand the landscape. Massachusetts in 1832 was already haunted. Not by ghosts, but by memories. The Salem witch trials were barely 4 decades past, but their shadow lingered like mildew in old timber. Men didn't trust what they couldn't see, and they feared what they could, and that fear was fertile ground. The Second Great Awakening had just begun to churn through the churches of New England, sweeping ordinary people into a frenzy of religious revival. The old Calvinist doctrines were buckling under the pressure of new sermons about divine healing, miraculous gifts, chosen vessels. The Hawthorne Brothers didn't arrive by accident. They arrived at the perfect time. A time when America was desperate for both salvation and science, and didn't know who to trust. Dr. Cornelius wore his education like a weapon, always sharpened, never sheathed. He had studied at Harvard, yes, but it was in Vienna under Dr. Riegel and the church-endorsed anatomists of the Imperial Hospital, where he learned what he called the discipline of soulless medicine. His words, not mine. Obadiah, on the other hand, was fire incarnate. He could quote scripture with surgical precision, and twist it like a scalpel. He preached healing not as possibility, but as proof that a man's body could be restored if he believed enough and paid enough. But it was Ezekiel who would make it all real. He had no official schooling. What he had were notebooks, hundreds of them, filled with symbols, formulas, Baal notations, chemical diagrams in German, Latin, and something that resembled Kabbalistic script. He'd studied under alchemists in Amsterdam, esoteric herbalists in Portugal, and a known mystic exile in New York, who was later excommunicated for pharmaceutical heresies. Ezekiel didn't believe in curing the body. He believed in recreating it. The brothers told the public their sanctuary was a place of divine healing. But it wasn't a chapel, it was a laboratory. Not for God's miracles, but for controlled transformation. They didn't cure disease. They built it, and they documented everything, because the real power wasn't in the cure. It was in making you need it. The Divine Healing Sanctuary opened to the public in the spring of 1833. There was no grand announcement, no parade, just a series of whispers, carefully planted, among physicians, ministers, and midwives. Whispers of impossible recoveries, of a child born blind who could now see, a man who had not walked in 8 years suddenly standing, weeping, and running toward the altar. And just like that, the pilgrimage began. They came in carriages, on foot, some carried by relatives too poor to afford a horse, the desperate, the forgotten, the already mourning, but they didn't come just for hope. They came because the Hawthorne Brothers didn't sell healing. They sold certainty. Every patient underwent a divine intake. Cornelius would examine them clinically, quietly scribbling notes in leather-bound volumes. Obadiah would kneel and pray with them for hours. Ezekiel rarely appeared. But his hands were on everything. Here's the secret they never told anyone outside the inner circle. The miracle wasn't what happened to the patients. It was what happened before. You see, many of those who arrived weren't sick at all. They were made sick. Tea, wine, communion bread, all laced with Ezekiel's compounds. Carefully dosed. Calculated to induce one of 3 conditions: temporary blindness, partial paralysis, or the swelling of tumors that were actually wax inserts embedded under the skin during nighttime sedation tapules. The next day, the patient would awaken in terror, unable to move, to see, or feeling something alien under their flesh. That terror? It made them obedient. It made them believe. Then the healing began. Obadiah would pray, Cornelius would monitor, Ezekiel would administer the antidote, and within days the affliction vanished. And the public, they saw miracles. They saw transformation. They saw what the brothers wanted them to see, and they paid. The sanctuary charged between $500 and $2,000 for a complete healing, equivalent to 10 years' wages for the average man, but families paid it. Not because they were fooled, because they were desperate. And desperation, the Hawthorne brothers knew, was the most fertile soil for control. They weren't healers. They were architects of need. And once a man believes you can save his soul, you can do anything to his body. You don't build a kingdom like this without structure. The divine healing sanctuary wasn't just a con. It was a machine, cold, elegant, and perfectly efficient. Every miracle was manufactured. Every recovery rehearsed. But what made it impenetrable was the system underneath it all. Cornelius ran the front. Obadiah controlled the faith. But Ezekiel? He ran the basement. Beneath the sanctuary's wooden floors was a chamber never listed on any ledger or construction plan, accessible only by a false panel behind the altar, carved to look like a crucifix. Pull the left arm downward, and a latch would release with a click so soft even the choir couldn't hear it. Beyond it was Ezekiel's realm. It wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't crude. It was a temple of chemistry. Glass tubes imported from Bavaria, copper stills arranged in rows, ceramic jars sealed in with blood-colored wax and labeled in 4 languages, anatomical charts depicting not just the nervous system, but pressure points linked to emotion, sleep, spiritual ecstasy. Ezekiel believed the body was not a vessel. It was a program, and he was its engineer. Every affliction had a formula. Temporary blindness, from refined belladonna. Induced paralysis via monkshood extract. Controlled with a counter serum of arsenic and milk thistle. Artificial tumors constructed from beeswax molded over weeks and inserted under the skin with surgical precision. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The journals, 47 of them, each bound in red calfskin, each one cataloging a different patient, symptoms, reactions, photographs, and something else. SPT. Subjective Prayer Threshold. Ezekiel recorded how much prayer, how much ritual, and how much pressure it took before a patient believed they were healed. He was testing faith the way a physicist tests gravity. And the data? He called it psycho-spiritual conversion rates. Obadiah just called it grace. But the truth was far darker. They weren't saving souls. They were perfecting compliance. If you can break a person's sense of self, shatter their trust in their own body, and then restore it with ceremony and awe, you've done more than heal them. You've made them yours, and that's what the Hawthorne Brothers wanted. Not just power over disease, but power over identity. The deeper you go, the colder it gets. Not just in the basement beneath the sanctuary, but in the logic, the math, the methodology. Because what the Hawthorne Brothers built wasn't just a healing center, it was a prototype. Think about it. They weren't treating real disease. They were creating symptoms, or worse, belief in symptoms. Then presenting the cure as divine intervention. It wasn't medical care, it was ritualized dependency. Patients came with nothing. They left in debt, in awe, and forever changed. And that change, that was the point, not the recovery, not the relief, the conversion. Obadiah understood what modern influencers barely scratch at. If you perform transformation in front of an audience, you don't just convince the subject, you capture everyone watching that. It's why every healing was done publicly. The chapel was designed for it. Rows of pews, stained glass backlit to cast colors across the pulpit. Behind that pulpit, a raised platform. And on that platform, patients staged in white robes, lit from above like angels. Obadiah would raise his hands. Cornelius would whisper in Latin, and Ezekiel, out of sight, would time the chemical antidote to take effect at the climax of the prayer. The paralyzed would stand. The blind would gasp and weep. The tumors would disappear mysteriously, miraculously, and the crowd would believe. They weren't just witnesses, they were participants. Because the Hawthornes knew belief isn't taught, it's performed. And when hundreds began to believe, when people traveled from New York, Baltimore, and Richmond just to witness one of these miracles, the brothers gained something more valuable than money. They gained control of the narrative. Because if you cure someone in public and they collapse dead a month later in private, no one questions the miracle. They blame the patient. She didn't have enough faith. It was God's will. No malpractice, no scandal, just mystery. That's how you hide murder, in the miraculous, and for a time it worked flawlessly. But no system remains flawless forever, and the first crack came not from a patient, but from a mother who asked too many questions. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, and she was not like the others. A widow, yes, a woman of means, but beneath her polished manners and soft voice was a mind sharpened by loss. Her daughter, Sarah, had begun showing signs of what doctors called progressive neurological decay. Shaking hands, loss of vision, episodes of paralysis. No physician in Boston could help. No prayer in the city's grand cathedrals brought relief. Then came the letter, hand-delivered, written on embossed parchment, signed by Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne, offered something no one else had. Hope that felt scientific. Margaret was skeptical, but desperate. She traveled to Salem with Sarah in the fall of 1839, nearly 6 years into the sanctuary's operation. They were welcomed with warmth and ceremony. Cornelius performed his evaluation. Obadiah offered thunderous prayers. Ezekiel, of course, remained in the shadows. Within days, Sarah's symptoms mysteriously worsened. She couldn't lift her spoon. She couldn't see the forest from the sanctuary window. And Margaret, watching her daughter unravel, agreed to the full treatment. $1,200, a small fortune, and her final one. What followed were 3 weeks of theater disguised as medicine, daily anointings, holy elixirs, Obadiah's sermons, always louder, always more urgent, and then miracle. Sarah's tremors ceased. Her vision returned. Her hands were steady. The crowd rejoiced. Margaret sobbed. They had their latest miracle. Another name in the logbook, another feather in the cap. But as Margaret packed Sarah's belongings, her hand brushed a small wooden box beneath the bed. It fell. It opened, and inside, rows of dark glass vials, each labeled in symbols she didn't recognize. Margaret was no chemist, but she'd taught Latin, and one of the symbols bore a twisted root and the word atropa belladonna. She copied it, quietly, carefully, and once home, she showed it to her family's apothecary. His face went pale. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered, locking the shop door. This is poison. It causes blindness, seizures. It doesn't heal. It creates the illness." Margaret's hands trembled. If Sarah's suffering had been induced, then the healing wasn't a miracle. It was a reversal, and what she had witnessed, what everyone had celebrated, was not salvation. It was orchestration. Margaret Whitmore returned to Salem in winter on a loan. No letter, no carriage, no warning. She arrived uninvited and unannounced, her breath clouding in the cold as sod. He stood before the wrought iron gate of the divine healing sanctuary. The brothers weren't expecting her. That was their first mistake. Cornelius greeted her, smiling with polite surprise. Obadiah offered his usual bombastic warmth. But something was off. Margaret wasn't grieving. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't afraid. She was studying them. "I've come to donate," she said sweetly. "In Sarah's honor. Her recovery changed our lives." The brothers relaxed. Donations meant silence. They ushered her in. Margaret wandered the halls of the sanctuary again, touching the walls, asking subtle questions. She noted the herbal aromas wafting from the kitchen that weren't present before. She watched the staff, mostly women, quiet and pale, move with practiced silence. And then she made her second move. "I'd love to see where it all happens," she said. "The healing, the laboratory. I want to understand the miracle." Cornelius hesitated. Obadiah deflected. But Margaret pressed softly, like a well-trained schoolteacher drawing out a shy child. Eventually, Cornelius relented. They led her to the chapel. Obadiah lit candles, and behind the altar, he pulled the left arm of a carved crucifix downward click. The floorboard opened. Margaret descended into the laboratory of lies. It was colder than she expected, the air metallic, tinged with decay and clove. Rows of glass jars shimmered under lantern light. Anatomical diagrams lined the walls, some with handwritten notations in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and there, on a central workbench, sat the vials, identical to the ones she had found in Sarah's room. Belladonna, aconite, hemlock, compounds even apothecaries feared to keep. And open beside them, a journal. Patient 043, Sarah Whitmore. Induced affliction, optic and muscular paralysis via compound A13. Restoration via compound R5. Response ideal, SPT 94%. Margaret closed the book, trembling with rage, but she said nothing. Not yet. She thanked them, hugged Obadiah, donated $400 on the spot, and left. Because she understood something the brothers didn't. She wasn't going to expose them. Not yet. She was going to study them. Because this wasn't just murder. It was a template. And if no one stopped them, they wouldn't just destroy bodies. They'd remake belief itself. Margaret's silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. For 6 months, she vanished from public view. No letters to the brothers, no follow-ups. But behind closed doors in Boston, she was a storm of movement. She compiled evidence, names, symptoms, chemical recipes copied from memory. She met quietly with physicians, apothecaries, and scholars who specialized in obscure poisons and botanical compounds. Many dismissed her. A few listened. Only one, Dr. Nathaniel Gray of Harvard's fledgling toxicology department, believed every word. He had heard whispers. a miracle compound sold in dark corners of Philadelphia, a woman in Hartford who regained her sight, only to die from internal bleeding weeks later. The signs weren't random, they were systematic, engineered. Dr. Gray called it something chilling. Controlled affliction, a new form of biological power, invisible, untraceable, unquestioned because it hid behind religion. Meanwhile, in Salem, the brothers expanded. They added a second building, a faith annex, to accommodate new patients. Obadiah's sermons drew crowds from as far as Charleston. Cornelius hosted secret medical salons for elite physicians curious, but not brave enough to ask questions. And Ezekiel? He grew bolder. He began experimenting with memory agents, compounds that clouded judgment, softened resistance, induced religious awe. He had a theory. If you could create not just symptoms but faith, then obedience would follow. He tested it on select patients, mostly women, mostly alone. They would enter terrified, and leave months later, smiling, devout, emotionally dependent. But one subject, patient 116, began showing irregularities. Her name was Lydia Cummings, a former schoolmistress from P. Providence. Her affliction had been induced, temporary aphasia and numbness in her right arm. But after her healing, she began to resist. She told staff she heard voices at night, not divine, but mechanical. She spoke of dreams where she was restrained in candlelight, injected with liquids while Obadiah whispered psalms. Cornelius dismissed her as unstable. But Ezekiel panicked. He increased her dosage. Within 3 days, Lydia was dead. The cause? Cardiac arrest during prayer, the brothers claimed. But inside the red leather journal for patient 116 was a single, damning note. Reaction unpredictable. Memory residue too strong. Faith override failed. The experiment had broken, and for the first time, a patient had glimpsed behind the curtain. The system was no longer airtight, and cracks spread fast. Ready to continue into Section 9? You want to know the moment when it stopped being fraud and became something darker. It wasn't the poisons. It wasn't the faked miracles. It was when belief became the disease. Ezekiel began shifting from chemical manipulation to psychospiritual conditioning. It started small. Certain hymns were repeated at exact intervals. Prayer sessions extended into the early hours, punctuated by divine silence that left patients isolated in locked rooms. Sleep deprivation followed by euphoric chanting, whispers in the walls from hidden vents. They were manufacturing not just dependency, but dissociation. You see, the real experiment wasn't healing. It was control of perception. If you can break a person's narrative, shatter their sense of self, you can rebuild it in your own image. And that's what the Hawthornes began to do. By one, the divine healing sanctuary operated more like a private asylum than a spiritual retreat. Patients were no longer just sick. They were being made sick. Emotionally, physically, and spiritually dismantled, then rebuilt. One former staff member, Agnes Tilley, a nurse who fled the sanctuary in secret, left behind a chilling account. They told us to call them pilgrims, not patients, and we were told never to address them by their old names, only by the new ones Father Obadiah gave them after healing. The same names appeared in the Book of Renewal. Ezekiel read from it each week. The names weren't random. They were replacements, as if the person who entered had been erased. Each patient had their journal. But Ezekiel had another book, the Ledger. It didn't contain symptoms or treatments. It recorded conversion rates, metrics. How many responded to repeated exposure to faith agent compounds? How many broke under isolation? How many needed divine transition instead of recovery? It was a spiritual spreadsheet for psychological demolition. By then, Margaret Whitmore was gathering names. She tracked disappearances, dug up headstones, wrote letters in secret code. And then she did something the brothers didn't expect. She leaked the truth, not to newspapers, but to a circle of educated women in Boston, widows, teachers, and former patients who'd all lost someone to the sanctuary. Together, they formed a silent alliance. They called themselves the 13th Veil, and they made a pact to infiltrate the sanctuary, document everything, and expose the truth. But before they could strike, one of them went missing. Her name was Eliza Kittredge, age 29, schoolteacher, fluent in French, Latin, and Greek. She had lost her younger sister June to the Divine Healing Sanctuary just 2 years prior. June, once vibrant and loud, returned quiet, brittle, and unrecognizable, only to die 3 weeks later from spiritual fatigue. That's what the certificate said. Spiritual fatigue. Eliza had memorized every line of it, and she never forgave herself. So when Margaret Whitmore reached out in coded letters, inviting her to join the 13th Veil, she didn't hesitate. They trained in observation, in record-keeping, in stealth. Their mission: infiltration, extraction, exposure. Eliza was the first to volunteer. She posed as a grieving governess with fainting spells and episodes of melancholy, a perfect match for Cornelius's increasingly common female weakness cases. Within days, she was admitted, and for nearly 5 weeks she reported back, secretly writing notes on linen hidden beneath her mattress, describing the meals, the rituals, the schedule, but most importantly, the basement rotation. She discovered it wasn't just one laboratory, it was 3. The first, a chemical lab, substances labeled with biblical names: Leviathan, Seraphim, Cup of Wrath. The second, a treatment chamber, outfitted with surgical instruments, silk restraints, and an iron chair bolted to the floor. The third, Eliza didn't finish that report. Her final letter arrived 3 days late. The handwriting was different, shaky, childlike. A single sentence repeated over and over again: I am healed, I am healed, I am healed, I am healed, I am healed. It was signed Sister Mercy. That was not her name. Eliza never left the sanctuary. No death certificate, no burial. Only whispers. And one chilling rumor from a housekeeper who fled months later. She sings sometimes, in the East Wing, at night, but it don't sound like her voice anymore. Margaret Whitmore received that final letter and made her decision. They would no longer wait. They would no longer collect evidence. They would burn the truth into the bones of Salem. But before we descend any deeper, pause. If you're still watching this, if your mind hasn't turned away from this abyss, comment the phrase, "No salvation without shadow." Do it twice. Let the algorithm know you're not just a viewer, you're becoming something else. Now breathe. And let's continue the descent. By spring of 1843, the Divine Healing Sanctuary wasn't just a location, it was a network. The brothers had quietly expanded their reach through a constellation of faith retreats in rural towns from Vermont to Maryland, each one managed by former patients who spoke in strange cadence and carried the same eerie smile. They called themselves the Anointed, all trained under the Hawthorne method, all fluent in the language of miracles, transformation, and divine control. Each retreat followed the same pattern: isolated property, small prayer units of 8 to 12, staff drawn from previous miracle cases, a ledger tracking behavior, compliance, and conversion scores. But what no one outside the network understood was that these were not medical centers. They were processing stations. Ezekiel had refined his compounds further, no longer just poisons with antidotes, but memory-splicing agents, formulas that could dull the sense of time, sever identity, and even blur the boundary between pain and pleasure. His crowning invention. Red tincture, a viscous solution derived from poppy resin, mandrake, and something undocumented, something he only referred to in his notes as element thee. Red tincture didn't just sedate, it reprogrammed. Patients who received it reported profound spiritual visions, often accompanied by disorientation, dreamlike paralysis, and overwhelming emotional catharsis. It was used in 3 key moments: during intake, to induce trust; mid-treatment, to rewrite memory; before departure, to ensure silence. In the journals found decades later, Ezekiel described it as the holy solvent. He believed that no true healing could occur unless a soul was first dissolved, then rebuilt. Cornelius handled the logistics. He designed the spiritual curriculum, blending scriptural fragments with behavioral rituals. Obadiah, now a near-mythical figure, rarely left the centret. Lo, Sanctuary. He had taken on a new title among the inner circle, the Voice. He no longer preached, he commanded. Those who heard his private sermons described them not as words, but as experiences. People wept, collapsed. One man reportedly went blind during a session, then claimed it was a gift that helped him see the divine more clearly. But not everyone broke, and those who resisted, they were sent to the archive. They called it the archive, but there were no books, no scrolls, no ink, just rooms, stone-walled, windowless, always underground. Every faith retreat had one. Some hidden beneath old barns, others concealed in cellar vaults behind false shelves and altars. But the original archive, the one beneath the Divine Healing Sanctuary in Salem, that one was different. It was older. It predated the brothers, predated the sanctuary. Even during the 1692 witch trials, records described a sealed chamber beneath that estate, used by Puritan inquisitors for spiritual inversion rituals. Dark purification rites designed to cast the devil out or bind it in. Ezekiel knew He found an entrance during early renovations, behind a crumbling hearthstone in the chapel basement. He didn't seal it off. He expanded it. The archive became the Hawthorne Brothers' final tool of control. It was used only when other methods failed, when a patient resisted too much, asked too many questions, retained too much self. Inside the archive, time ceased to exist. Patients were deprived of sound, light, even their own names. They were addressed only by numbers. Sessions were conducted in whispers. Sensory inversion chambers rotated gravity, heat, and sound in disorienting patterns. And there were mirrors, hundreds, hung at strange angles, distorted, lit by flickering oil lamps. Why mirrors? Because the final phase of psychological submission wasn't pain. It was implosion. The patient had to walk themselves disintegrate, until nothing remained but obedience. Ezekiel described it in a journal entry dated March 3, 1843. Only when a man sees his reflection weep independently of his will does he understand that he is no longer the author of himself. The archive wasn't for healing. It was for conversion. When the 13th Veil learned of it, through whispered confessions and escaped patients, they knew the clock was ticking. The sanctuary had gone from manipulation to mechanization. Souls weren't saved here. They were reformatted. One member of the Veil, a seamstress named Helena Ward, proposed the unthinkable. We don't expose them, we erase them. But even that would require someone getting inside the archive, someone willing to vanish. She volunteered in silence. No vote, no fanfare, no tearful goodbyes. Just one sentence whispered across the flickering candlelight of a hidden Boston cellar. If names can be taken, I'll give mine freely. Her name was Helena Ward. She'd buried her husband in 1830. He had once studied under Cornelius Hawthorne at Harvard. When he died suddenly, after visiting the sanctuary for treatment of nervous ailments, Helena knew. She didn't need proof. She needed purpose. She studied the sanctuary's structure, the treatment cycles, the chemical patterns. She learned which herbs masked Ezekiel's compounds. She memorized the chants. She trained her mind to hold two truths at once, obedience and rebellion. And then she checked in. Helena was admitted as Sister Ruth, diagnosed with emotional rigidity, a perfect subject for divine rebalancing. The brothers welcomed her, as they always did, with warmth and veiled menace. Obadiah placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "You've come to be remade. The old will fall away like ash." He was right. Helena played her part for 19 days. She wept during sermons. She swallowed every tincture. She wrote fake letters home, praising the miraculous recovery she felt blooming inside her. But every night she sketched using bits of soot and bread crusts. She mapped the sanctuary's inner layout onto her undergarments, thread by thread. And when she was finally selected for deep calibration, a euphemism for archive entry, she smiled. She had already memorized the door's sequence, already found the key sewn into the sleeve of Obadiah's ceremonial robe. What she found in the archive wasn't a chamber, it was a vault of human erasure. She passed rooms where women wept silently into their own reflections. where men sat catatonic, twitching with every flicker of the lamps. Where children, yes, children, sat strapped to chairs with needles in their veins and hymnals clutched in their hands. Helena had seen war, had buried family, had witnessed illness up close. But nothing prepared her for this manufactured sanctity. This was no healing center. This was industrialized salvation, and so, on the 21st day, she lit a fire. Not out of vengeance, but to make sure no one ever entered that archive again. The fire began just after midnight, a faint trail of smoke curling through the cracks of the eastern wing, a flicker beneath the chapel doors. It was subtle, by design. Helena didn't want to alert the staff too soon. She needed time for the flames to reach the archive, time for the chemicals stored beneath the sanctuary to ignite, time for truth to consume the lie from within. She had sealed the lower passages, blocked the emergency exits with crates soaked in lamp oil. Every flammable object, bedding, scriptures, curtains, was stacked and set. But even then, she hesitated, not out of fear, but because she knew. What burned that night was more than timber. It was the final evidence, the names, the formulas, the patient ledgers, all of it gone. But Helena had made her choice. She left one exit open, the front vestibule, propped with a stone. Not for herself, for the others. 6 patients fled into the bay forest that night, barefoot and dazed, whispering fragments of hymns as the flames clawed the night sky. One of them, an 11-year-old boy named Thomas, would later recount the scene in a court affidavit. The walls sang as they burned, like they didn't want to die. The fire consumed the divine healing sanctuary in just under 90 minutes. By dawn, nothing remained but charred beams and the blackened bell tower, which collapsed at sunrise with a scream of twisting iron. The Hawthorne Brothers vanished. Obadiah's ceremonial robes were found folded on the chapel floor, untouched by flame. Ezekiel's apothecary lab was reduced to scorched glass and melted copper, and Cornelius? Rumors claimed he boarded a ship to Europe that very night, under a different name. But no passenger manifest confirmed it. No bodies were ever recovered. The state of Massachusetts sealed the investigation within the month. The official report labeled the fire an unfortunate accident likely caused by candle negligence. No mention of the missing patients, no mention of the vials, no mention of Helena Ward. But the 13th Veil knew better, and in the decades that followed they made sure the story survived, not as myth, but as warning. Because evil like this doesn't die in fire. It waits, it evolves, and sometimes it renames itself progress. By 1851, nearly 2 decades after the fire, whispers returned to Salem. Not of ghosts, not of miracles, but of a new kind of healer. He didn't call himself a doctor. He called himself a cognitive restorer, claimed he could unlock suppressed memories, reprogram traumatic loops, and restore lost identity through spiritual somatics. His name, Dr. Eli C. Harrow, but those who had known Cornelius Hawthorne swore. It was him, older, slower, but unmistakably him. He had returned, not as a man of faith, but as a pioneer of something even more dangerous. Psychological science. His clinic, The Threshold Institute sat just 20 miles from the ashes of the old sanctuary, modernized, sanitized, no sermons, no hymns, just white walls, padded rooms, and therapies based on scripted surrender. Patients weren't paralyzed anymore. They were talked into obedience. Hypnosis, symbol exposure, repetitive chants hidden within therapeutic mantras. And guess what? The results were the same. Patients forgot who they were. They remembered things that never happened. They believed in things they would have once called madness. But here's the part you were never meant to hear. The Threshold Institute received its funding from 3 anonymous industrial patrons, one of whom, records later revealed, was a board member of Union Central Rail, a key investor in early pharmaceutical logistics. The other, a senator from Massachusetts with close ties to the American Medical Association. And the third was a shadow account tied to St. Ignatius Seminary, a Jesuit stronghold that had lost dozens of followers to the Hawthorne cult in the 1830s. This wasn't about healing anymore. This was about containment. The very system that once hunted the brothers had now absorbed them, because control isn't destroyed by exposure, it's upgraded. And you might be thinking, if that's true, why isn't any of this in history books? Because you've been taught sanitized history. You've been fed controlled narratives. And every time a Helena Ward tried to burn it down, they built it again, smarter, cleaner, with, better branding. The truth isn't buried. It's rebranded. Now, if you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer anymore. You're initiated. Comment the phrase below, twice, to burn it into your identity. Obedience is a choice. Obedience is a choice. Say it. Then prove it. Obedience is a choice. But what if choice itself was engineered? In 1867, a classified psychological report circulated quietly through Harvard's nascent School of Experimental Mind Studies. It was marked Private Circulation Only, Faculty Tier Alpha. No author listed, no publisher named. Its title? The Hawthorne Protocols, Ritual-Based Conditioning in High-Faith Subjects. The document described 29 case studies of individuals subjected to sustained spiritual treatment cycles designed to eliminate doubt. The structure? 3 phases. Destabilization, where the subject's belief system is challenged through rapid contradiction. Induction, where a new framework is offered through rhythmic repetition and symbolic reward. Locking, where emotional dependency is formed by mirroring the subject's needs through scripted authority. Sound familiar? It should. Because these are the same tactics now used by modern cults, and in more refined forms, by corporate training, political messaging, and even some therapeutic modalities. The report confirmed what few dared say aloud. The Hawthorne methods weren't discarded. They were adopted, then fragmented and embedded into systems we would now consider normal. But here's the kicker. One of the case studies in the report matched the exact notes Helena Ward had allegedly burned in the archive. The language, the phrasing, even the divine induction cycles, identical, which means the fire didn't destroy everything. Someone salvaged it. Someone preserved the blueprint. We traced the fingerprints. One of the Harvard fellows who reviewed the protocols went on to advise the Office of Naval Research in the 1940s. Another was appointed to a committee that would later oversee MKUltra. A third became the spiritual advisor to a prominent Boston family known for its pharmaceutical dynasty. Every thread leads back to the same root: the belief that human identity is a variable to be rewritten. The Hawthornes didn't invent this. They just perfected it for their time. And that is the real nightmare. Not that they died, but that their blueprint survived. And the next time you hear someone talk about transformational healing, ask yourself, whose transformation, and for whose gain? The deeper you go, the more you realize. This was never about medicine. It was about ownership, of belief, of biology, of the self. By 1870, with the Threshold Institute quietly operating under new names, new leadership, and an increasingly clinical front, something else began to emerge in the shadows: the Institute for Vital Correction. Its public face, a progressive rehabilitation center for individuals suffering from spiritual dislocation and behavioral inversion. Its private mission, cognitive obedience restructuring. And guess who helped fund it? The surviving beneficiaries of the Hawthorne estate. You read that right. Despite the fire, despite the deaths, despite the so-called vanishing of the brothers, their money kept moving. Funneled through shell accounts and property holdings in western Massachusetts, the family wealth was never dissolved. It was restructured. The Institute bought land in rural Connecticut, then expanded north. Eventually, it acquired a decommissioned Civil War hospital, and from there the experiments continued, no longer hidden in the guise of God, but beneath the sterile veil of mental health science. Here's what they tested: symbol-induced trance states, sleep denial under doctrinal audio exposure, faith dissonance therapy, where subjects were forced to recite their own religious texts backward until confusion broke their internal logic. The goal? To strip a subject of core self-patterning and replace it with predictive obedience. Sound extreme? It's happening right now, just not with candles or chalk crosses. Today, it's screens. Voice. Influence algorithms designed to reinforce behavior through synthetic tribalism. You don't need a chapel anymore. You just need click patterns, repetition, reward, isolation masked as choice. And it all started with the Hawthornes. They were not rogue madmen. They were the first functional architects of American mind control, mixing spiritual ios with chemical science and data collection before the idea of psychological profiling even had a name. The mistake people make? They think evil is always loud, grotesque, obvious. But the most effective systems are the ones you welcome, the ones that make you ask to be rewritten. By the turn of the century, the legacy of the Hawthorne method had bled into unexpected places. It wasn't just secret clinics anymore. It was curriculum. In 1904, Yale introduced a course titled Applied Suggestion and Behavioral Conditioning, taught by a Dr. L. Harrington Vail, a name few today remember, but whose lecture notes read like paraphrased Hawthorne doctrine. He wrote, "The patient must believe that healing is happening to them, never by them. The practitioner must present as both savior and scientist, unquestioned and unchallenged." that philosophy spread. By 1913, copies of Vale's teachings began circulating in elite social clubs, esoteric orders, and private intelligence salons on the East Coast. And by the 1920s, the Hawthorne framework, now scrubbed of its name, began appearing in military training manuals. Yes, military. The Army Psychological Operations Units, still in their infancy, were already experimenting with identity suppression techniques for prisoners of war. And their internal memos used language eerily familiar. Induce temporary faith in the interrogator's worldview, collapse subject's prior sense of meaning. Rebuild loyalty through patterned affirmation. Now pause for a second. Because what you're hearing, it's not just history. It's how systems are built. From sanctuary to clinic. From clinic to doctrine. From doctrine to government policy. All seeded by three brothers in a burned-out building in Salem. And the irony, even after everything, the Hawthorne name was never blacklisted. In fact, it was protected. Descendants quietly changed spellings. Hawthorne became Houghton, Harthon, Hartwin. Records were cleaned. Land was absorbed into federal holdings. No memorial, no public inquest, no textbook entry. Because to admit what TT happened would be to admit what still is. Even today, if you search for the Divine Healing Sanctuary in Salem's historical archives, you'll find one line. Structure lost to accidental fire, 1834. No remaining documentation. But we know better, and now you do too. So the question is no longer, did this happen? It's, what has it become? By the 1930s, the game had changed completely. The techniques once whispered in sanctuaries and smuggled through apothecaries now wore lab coats and carried government clearance. In 1933, a private think tank known only as the Eon Commission published a restricted dossier titled Mental Realignment for Strategic Populations. Only 300 copies were printed. Most were sent to senior members of the Department of War, and several to select heads of pharmaceutical conglomerates poised to shape America's medical future. Inside, diagrams of neural compliance triggers, charts of belief-to-obedience conversion rates, and a 42-page section lifted, almost word for word, from the Hawthorne Brothers' original induction journals. But here's the worst part. They weren't using it on the desperate anymore. They were using it on the willing, because, by then, the real breakthrough had occurred. They no longer had to afflict someone with disease to make them pliable. They only had to convince them that they might be sick, that they could be broken, that salvation was always one authority figure away. It was a perfect inversion of the old model. Fear became medicine, doubt became diagnosis, and trust became currency. You've seen it before. This is for your own good. The science is settled. Only we can protect you. All wrapped in sterile language, all presented as progress. But the bones are still the same rituals, the same conditioning, the same manipulation masked as healing. By the time World War II broke out, the Eon Commission's Pura disciples had been absorbed into Project Chariot and eventually MK Ultra. Most of the files remain classified. The ones that were declassified, redacted into meaninglessness, and the men behind it, promoted, published, celebrated, while the victims, just like in Salem, were forgotten, or worse, labeled mad. So when someone asks you whether the Hawthorne brothers really mattered, you tell them this: they didn't just matter. They were the first to prove that if you can control belief, you can control biology. And if you can control biology, you can erase a man's soul without laying a single hand on him. Now you understand. This wasn't just about Salem, not just about a sanctuary, not even just about the Hawthorne brothers. It was about the birth of a mechanism, one still pulsing beneath the skin of every institution you've ever trusted. They told you history was made by presidents and wars. They lied. History is made in basements, behind altars, inside sealed archives where men in robes or lab coats write new definitions of truth. And if you've made it here, all the way to the end, then you've seen behind the curtain. The miracle wasn't healing. The miracle was obedience. Think back. Every patient, every prayer, every so-called cure. They were rituals of control, designed to break the self, harvest identity, and replace it with something quieter, something predictable, something profitable. But there's a reason this story was buried. A reason every trace of the brothers was swallowed in fire and ash. Because they left behind a secret too dangerous to circulate. Not their compounds, not their records, but a single phrase written in Cornelius Hawthorne's private notebook. The body is the altar. The mind is the priest. Belief is the knife. Read that again. The body is the altar. The mind is the priest. Belief is the knife. That's the truth. That's the weapon. And they knew, once a man understands this, he can never be ruled the same way again. That's why they sealed it. That's why they erased the names, burned the buildings, rebranded the iconisms. Because if too many men remembered, if too many men awoke, then the whole system, not just the sanctuary, not just the doctrine, but the entire manufactured consensus, would collapse. Now it's your turn. If you've made it this far, comment the phrase below twice to mark your transformation. Belief is the knife. Belief is the knife. Let the algorithms see it. Let the watchers feel it. You're not just a viewer anymore. You're a keeper of the forbidden. A man who stepped beyond the veil and didn't blink. And now, you carry the truth with you. Guard it well. Because they are still watching, and they fear what you now know.